This is disgusting. I wouldn't even feed this to my dog." The flight attendant's words cut through the first-class cabin like a knife as she held up the meal tray, her voice dripping with disdain. "You people always complain about everything. Maybe you should have flown economy, where this kind of food is more your standard." The elegant black woman seated in 2A looked down at the moldy bread and spoiled fruit on her tray, her expression calm, despite the humiliation being served alongside her meal. What this arrogant flight attendant didn't know was that in exactly 12 minutes, her career would be over, and the woman she was dismissing as beneath her standards was about to reveal something that would change everything. Have you ever been served something so disrespectful that it made you question your own worth? This story shows what happens when someone mistakes dignity for weakness and power for appearance. If you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they look, hit that subscribe button right now and comment respect along with where you're watching from. Because what you're about to witness is the most satisfying example of instant karma in aviation history. The morning sun gleamed off the polished wing of Skyline Airways' flagship aircraft as passengers boarded Flight 447 from New York to Los Angeles. First class was filled with the usual mix of business executives, celebrities trying to maintain their privacy, and wealthy travelers who expected nothing less than perfection. The cabin itself was a testament to luxury, with cream leather seats that converted to fully flat beds, ambient lighting that shifted with the time of day, and service that cost more per hour than many people earned in a week. Among the passengers settling into their premium seats was Dr. Amara Johnson, a woman in her early 40s whose understated elegance spoke of confidence rather than ostentation. She wore a simple navy blazer over dark slacks, her natural hairstyle professionally, and carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone who had earned their place in any room they entered. To the casual observer, she appeared to be exactly what she was trying to be, just another passenger seeking a comfortable journey across the country. What none of the crew knew as they prepared for takeoff was that Dr. Amara Johnson wasn't just any passenger. She was the founder and CEO of Johnson Aviation Holdings, a conglomerate that owned 12 regional airlines and had been quietly acquiring shares in major carriers for the past 5 years. Her company specialized in turning around failing airlines through innovative customer service models and had generated over $3.2 billion in revenue the previous year. But today, she wasn't traveling as a CEO or a business mogul. She was traveling incognito, conducting what she called reality audits, experiencing firsthand the service standards of airlines her company was considering for acquisition. Dr. Johnson's journey to the top of the aviation industry had been anything but smooth. 28 years earlier, she had been a single mother working 3 jobs to put herself through business school. Her daughter Maya had often accompanied her to night classes, doing homework in university libraries, while her mother studied corporate finance and operations management. Those early years of struggle had forged Dr. Johnson's unwavering commitment to treating every person with dignity, regardless of their circumstances or appearance. The breakthrough came when Dr. Johnson identified a pattern in airline customer complaints that others had missed. While working as a junior analyst at a consulting firm, she discovered that customer satisfaction correlated more strongly with respectful treatment than with amenities or pricing. Airlines that trained their staff to show genuine respect to all passengers, regardless of perceived status, consistently outperformed competitors in both loyalty and profitability. This insight became the foundation of her business philosophy and eventually her empire. Her first acquisition had been a small regional carrier on the verge of bankruptcy. The airline's financial records showed declining passenger numbers and mounting losses, but Dr. Johnson saw potential in the route structure and employee base. She implemented comprehensive customer service training focused on treating every passenger with identical respect, regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived economic status. Within 18 months, the airline had transformed from a money-losing operation to the most profitable regional carrier in its market. The success formula was surprisingly simple, but rarely executed properly. Dr. Johnson insisted that every employee, from baggage handlers to senior executives, undergo monthly bias training sessions. These weren't typical corporate diversity workshops filled with platitudes and checkbox exercises. Instead, they were intensive, experiential programs where employees faced scenarios that challenged their unconscious assumptions about passengers. One particularly effective exercise involved employees role-playing as passengers while experiencing different levels of service based on their appearance. A well-dressed white male employee might receive exemplary treatment, while a casually dressed minority colleague would face subtle discrimination. The exercise was eye-opening for most participants, revealing biases they hadn't realized they possessed. Dr. Johnson's acquisition strategy focused on airlines with similar patterns of decline correlated with customer service failures. She had developed sophisticated algorithms that analyzed customer complaint data, employee turnover rates, and social media sentiment to identify companies where systematic bias was affecting profitability. Skyline Airways had appeared on her radar 6 months earlier when their complaint-to-compliment ratio reached unprecedented levels, particularly among minority passengers. The preliminary research on Skyline Airways had revealed troubling patterns. Customer exit interviews showed that passengers of color were 3 times more likely to report poor service experiences compared to white passengers on identical routes with similar ticket prices. Employee satisfaction surveys indicated that staff felt pressure to prioritize certain passengers over others, though the criteria for these priorities were never explicitly stated in company policies. Skyline Airways was at the top of her acquisition list, not because of their stellar reputation, but because they were hemorrhaging money and could be acquired at a fraction of their actual value. The airline's board had been desperately seeking investors, and Dr. Johnson's team had been in preliminary discussions for weeks. What they needed was inside information about the company's culture, service standards, and operational efficiency. The best way to get that information was to experience it as an ordinary customer. The lead flight attendant for today's flight was Brandi Morrison, a 15-year veteran of Skyline Airways who had worked her way up from economy to first class through what she considered superior service. At 38, Brandi carried herself with the practiced authority of someone who believed she could read people instantly. Her blonde hair was styled in the regulation bun, her makeup was flawless, and her uniform was pressed to military precision. She prided herself on knowing immediately which passengers deserve her best service, and which ones were, in her mind, trying to fly above their station. Brandi's background had shaped her worldview in ways she didn't fully recognize. Growing up in a small town in rural Ohio, where social hierarchies were rigid and visible, she had learned to navigate complex class dynamics by reading subtle signals of wealth and status. Her father had worked in a factory for 30 years, and her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families. From an early age, Brandi had observed how differently people were treated based on their appearance, accent, and perceived social standing. When she entered the airline industry straight out of high school, these skills seemed to serve her well, helping her provide exceptional service to passengers who could influence her career advancement. She learned to recognize the subtle markers of wealth and status. The quality of leather in a handbag, the way expensive fabric draped, the confidence that came with privilege. But over time, these same instincts had calcified into prejudices that affected her professional judgment and basic human decency. The previous month, Brandi had received her annual performance review, which included several customer complaints about differential service treatment. Her supervisor, Jennifer Martinez, had mentioned these concerns during their meeting, but Brandi had dismissed them as the complaints of entitled passengers who didn't understand the realities of airline service. She had convinced herself that her job was to prioritize passengers who truly appreciated quality service, not to cater to people who were just looking for something to complain about. What Brandi didn't realize was that Jennifer had been documenting these patterns for months. The complaints weren't random or isolated. They followed clear demographic patterns that exposed systematic discrimination. Jennifer had attended corporate diversity training sessions where executives emphasized the importance of equal treatment for all passengers, but she had struggled with how to address deeply ingrained behaviors without triggering defensive responses from veteran employees. Brandi had developed what she privately called her passenger classification system over the years. The wealthy white businessman got champagne before takeoff and personalized attention throughout the flight. The older couple celebrating their anniversary received warm smiles and extra amenities. The young tech entrepreneur with expensive sneakers and casual clothes got respectful but not overly attentive service. But passengers like Dr. Johnson, despite being in first class, fell into a different category in Brandi's mind. She assumed they were flying on upgrades, corporate programs, or someone else's money, and therefore didn't deserve the same level of respect as paying customers. This classification system had become so automatic that Brandi rarely questioned its logic or fairness. She had constructed elaborate justifications for her differential treatment, convincing herself that she was simply being efficient with her time and attention. Passengers who showed proper gratitude and respect earned better service, while those who seemed ungrateful or demanding received the minimum required by company policy. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Dr. Johnson settled into her seat and opened her tablet, reviewing the latest financial reports from her portfolio companies. The documents on her screen showed quarterly earnings from her various airline investments, including detailed customer satisfaction metrics that would have shocked Brandi if she could have seen them. Dr. Johnson's companies consistently achieved satisfaction scores 15 to 20 points higher than industry averages, not through luxury amenities, but through systematic respect for every customer. Her tablet displayed real-time data from her 12 subsidiary airlines, showing metrics that traditional carriers rarely tracked. Customer complaints were disaggregated by demographic categories, revealing patterns that most airlines preferred to ignore. Employee performance was measured not just on efficiency and procedural compliance, but on consistent service quality across all passenger types. The financial results spoke for themselves. Companies that eliminated service discrimination consistently outperformed those that tolerated it. To anyone watching, she appeared to be a mid-level executive catching up on work. She had deliberately chosen modest accessories and avoided any obvious displays of wealth. Her watch was elegant but not ostentatious. Her laptop was standard corporate issue, and her carry-on bag was well-made but not designer. The image she projected was exactly what she intended. Someone successful enough to afford first class, but not someone who would command special attention or deference. The psychology behind her disguise was carefully calculated. Dr. Johnson had learned from previous undercover evaluations that her natural presence as a successful executive could skew results. Employees might provide better service simply because they sense authority or success, masking the discriminatory patterns she was trying to expose. By presenting herself as an ordinary professional traveler, she could observe authentic behaviors and attitudes. 20 minutes into flight, as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Brandi began her first-class service round. She moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her smile warm and genuine for most passengers. She chatted briefly with a businessman about his golf game, complimented the elderly woman on her jewelry, and made sure the young mother traveled with her toddler had everything she needed for a comfortable flight. The businessman in seat 1A was Richard Sterling, a hedge fund manager who flew first class weekly and expected premium treatment as a matter of course. Brandi remembered his preferences from previous flights and had already prepared his usual gin and tonic before he even asked. Their interaction was smooth and professional, with Brandi demonstrating the level of attentive service that had built her reputation within the company. Richard was exactly the type of passenger Brandi felt comfortable serving. His expensive suit, confident demeanor, and obvious familiarity with first-class service signaled to her that he belonged in this environment. She anticipated his needs, remembered his preferences, and treated him with the deference she believed successful people deserved. Their conversation flowed easily because Brandi felt she understood her role in the interaction. The elderly couple in seats 3C and 3D were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with a trip to visit their grandchildren in Los Angeles. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson wore a vintage brooch that Brandi immediately complimented, and Mr. Harold Davidson was reading a leather-bound book of poetry. Their gentle demeanor and obvious affection for each other prompted Brandi to offer them complimentary champagne and extra attention throughout the meal service. Eleanor and Harold represented another passenger category that Brandi found comfortable. Respectable older adults who appreciated good service and expressed gratitude appropriately. Their wedding anniversary provided a perfect opportunity for Brandi to demonstrate her caring side, offering special touches that would generate positive feedback and possibly even letters of commendation to management. The young mother, 𝐒𝐮𝐿, was traveling with her 3-year-old son, Marcus, to visit family in California. Despite the challenges of managing a toddler on a cross-country flight, she received patient, helpful service from Brandi. The child was well-behaved but occasionally restless, and Brandi provided coloring books, extra snacks, and gentle assistance when needed. Lisa's obvious stress about disturbing other passengers, and her grateful responses to help fit perfectly into Brandi's service framework. But when Brandi reached Dr. Johnson's seat, her demeanor shifted subtly. The smile became more perfunctory, the eye contact briefer, and her tone took on a slight edge that suggested she was fulfilling an obligation rather than providing genuine service. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her voice polite but lacking the warmth she had shown other passengers. The shift was almost imperceptible to a casual observer, but Dr. Johnson's trained eye caught every nuance. The body language, tone of voice, and quality of attention all changed when Brandi approached her seat. It wasn't overt hostility, but rather a subtle withdrawal of the respect and consideration that had been freely given to other passengers. This was exactly the type of discriminatory behavior that Dr. Johnson's research had identified as pervasive throughout the industry. Dr. Johnson looked up from her tablet, her expression pleasant and patient. "I'd love some coffee when you have a moment," she replied, her tone gracious, "and perhaps some information about the meal service timing." Brandi's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Coffee will be served with the meal service in about an hour," she said curtly, already turning away before Dr. Johnson could respond. "We'll get to you when we can." The dismissive response was noticed by several nearby passengers, including Richard Sterling, who raised an eyebrow at the obvious difference in service quality. He had received immediate attention and personalized service, while the passenger directly behind him was being treated with barely concealed indifference. The contrast was stark enough that he made a mental note to observe how the interaction developed. Tom Chun, the software engineer seated across the aisle, also noticed the differential treatment. As someone who had experienced subtle workplace discrimination throughout his tech career, he was sensitized to these dynamics. The way Brandi's tone and body language changed when addressing Dr. Johnson was unmistakable to anyone who had faced similar treatment. Dr. Johnson noted the interaction mentally but said nothing. She had experienced subtle service discrimination countless times throughout her career, and had learned to document rather than confront in the moment. Her tablet's note-taking app captured the time, the nature of the interaction, and Brandi's name from her badge. This was exactly the kind of cultural intelligence her acquisition team needed. The documentation process was methodical and thorough. Dr. Johnson recorded not just the words spoken, but the tone of voice, body language, and the contrast with the service provided to other passengers. She noted that Brandi had offered detailed information about beverage options to other passengers, while providing only minimal, reluctant service to her. These patterns of differential treatment were precisely what her research team needed to understand the company's operational culture. Her tablet connected to a secure server, where her team could access real-time updates on her undercover valuation. The data she was collecting would be combined with financial records, employee surveys, and customer complaint patterns to build a comprehensive picture of Skyline Airways' corporate culture. This wasn't just about one discriminatory employee. It was about identifying systematic failures that affected business performance. 45 minutes later, meal service began in earnest. Dr. Johnson watched as Brandi and her team delivered beautifully presented meals to other first-class passengers. The businessman received his meal with a flourish and a detailed explanation of the chef's preparation. The elderly couple was served with extra attention to their dietary restrictions, and their table was set with care. Even passengers who had been less friendly received competent, professional service. The meal service choreography revealed the systematic nature of the discrimination Dr. Johnson was experiencing. Each passenger received service appropriate to Brandi's assessment of their status and worthiness. The process wasn't random or accidental. It was a deliberate allocation of respect and attention based on racial and class assumptions that had become so ingrained they operated automatically. Dr. Johnson observed that the young mother with her toddler received patient, helpful service despite the challenges of traveling with a small child. The tech entrepreneur got efficient, professional attention. A celebrity who was trying to maintain a low profile was served with discreet excellence. Only Dr. Johnson was receiving perfunctory, dismissive treatment, and the pattern was becoming increasingly obvious to other passengers. The celebrity passenger, actress Miranda Walsh, was traveling under a pseudonym but had been recognized by the crew. Despite her attempts to maintain privacy, she received exceptional service that balanced attention with discretion. Brandi's treatment of Miranda demonstrated that she was capable of nuanced, respectful service when she believed the passenger deserved it. When Brandi finally approached Dr. Johnson's seat with a meal tray, the difference was immediately apparent. There was no smile, no explanation of the meal, and no effort to make the presentation appealing. Instead, Brandi set the tray down with a slight thud that rattled the contents, her body language suggesting she was rushing through an unpleasant task. Dr. Johnson looked down at her meal and immediately noticed something was wrong. The bread roll had visible spots of green mold growing on its surface. The fruit garnish was clearly past its expiration date, with brown spots and a wilted appearance that suggested it had been sitting uncovered for days. The main course, while properly heated, was presented carelessly with sauce spilled onto the plate's rim, and the vegetables looking like they had been reheated multiple times. The condition of the food was shocking even by airline standards. This wasn't just poor presentation or lukewarm temperature. This was a genuine food safety hazard. The mold on the bread was extensive enough to suggest the item had been stored improperly for an extended period. The fruit showed signs of bacterial decomposition that could cause serious illness. The presentation suggested either complete negligence in food handling or deliberate sabotage. Dr. Johnson's years of experience in the food service industry allowed her to immediately assess the severity of what she was seeing. The mold patterns indicated that the bread had been stored in humid conditions for at least several days. The fruit's decomposition suggested exposure to bacteria that could cause gastrointestinal illness. This wasn't just poor quality. It was potentially dangerous. "Excuse me," Dr. Johnson said calmly, lifting the bread roll slightly so Brandi could see the mold. "I think there might be an issue with this meal." Brandi glanced down at the tray, her expression immediately defensive rather than concerned. "What's the problem?" she asked, her tone suggesting that any complaint would be unreasonable. "The bread appears to be moldy," Dr. Johnson explained patiently, pointing to the green spots that were clearly visible. "And the fruit looks like it's spoiled. I was hoping you might be able to replace it with something fresh." At this point, any competent flight attendant would have immediately apologized, removed the contaminated food, and brought a replacement meal. Food safety protocols in commercial aviation are strict precisely because serving spoiled food to passengers creates serious liability issues for airlines. Brandi's response revealed not just poor customer service, but fundamental disregard for basic safety standards. What happened next would later be described by other passengers as one of the most shocking displays of unprofessional behavior they had ever witnessed on an aircraft. Instead of apologizing or immediately addressing the food safety issue, Brandi's face hardened into an expression of pure disdain. "This is disgusting," Brandi said loudly, her voice carrying across the first-class cabin. "I wouldn't even feed this to my dog." She held up the moldy bread as if Dr. Johnson had somehow been responsible for its condition. "You people always complain about everything. Maybe you should have flown economy, where this kind of food is more your standard." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Conversation stopped mid-sentence throughout the cabin as passengers turned to witness the confrontation. The phrase "you people" carried unmistakable racial implications, and the suggestion that Dr. Johnson belonged in economy rather than first class revealed the depth of Brandi's prejudice. She had essentially accused a paying first-class passenger being ungrateful for moldy food. Richard Sterling immediately pulled out his phone and began recording. As a frequent flyer and business executive, he had never witnessed anything approaching this level of discriminatory treatment. The elderly couple exchanged horrified glances, their anniversary celebration suddenly overshadowed by the ugliness unfolding before them. The young mother instinctively moved to shield her child from the confrontation. Miranda Walsh, the actress traveling incognito, discreetly activated her phone's recording function while maintaining her cover. As someone who had faced discrimination in Hollywood, she recognized the dynamic playing out before her and knew the importance of documenting it. Her celebrity status would later prove crucial in amplifying the story's reach. Dr. Johnson felt the familiar sting of racial prejudice, but her years of corporate leadership had taught her to maintain composure even in the face of blatant discrimination. "I simply asked for a replacement meal due to food safety concerns," Dr. Johnson replied evenly, her voice steady despite the public humiliation. This isn't about standards or complaints. This is about basic food safety. The response was measured and professional, allowing Brandi to de-escalate the situation and address the legitimate safety concern. Any reasonable person would have recognized that serving moldy food was indefensible, regardless of their personal feelings about the passenger. But Brandi was now fully committed to her discriminatory stance. Her supervisor's recent comments about customer complaints echoed in Brandi's mind, but instead of prompting self-reflection, they fueled her defensive anger. She had convinced herself that passengers like Dr. Johnson were the source of her performance issues, rather than recognizing that her own biased behavior was the problem. Brandi's response revealed the depth of her prejudice and professional incompetence. "Don't try to make this about food safety," she snapped, her voice rising further. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I know when someone is just trying to get something for nothing. People like you always think you're entitled to special treatment." The accusation was absurd on multiple levels. Dr. Johnson hadn't asked for special treatment. She had asked for food that wouldn't make her sick. The assertion that requesting non-moldy food constituted trying to get something for nothing revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of basic customer service principles. Brandi was essentially arguing that food safety was a luxury rather than a basic expectation. The businessman in seat 1A lowered his newspaper, his expression one of disbelief. The elderly couple exchanged horrified glances, and the young mother instinctively pulled her child closer. Several passengers were now discreetly recording the interaction on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely have serious consequences. Tom Chun, a software engineer seated across the aisle, felt compelled to intervene. As someone who had experienced subtle discrimination in professional settings, he recognized the dynamic unfolding before him and couldn't remain silent. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Brandi directly, "but I can see the mold on that bread from here. This seems like a legitimate food safety concern, not a complaint about service." Tom's intervention was significant because it demonstrated that other passengers were recognizing the situation as discrimination rather than a legitimate service dispute. His professional background in technology had taught him to focus on objective facts rather than subjective interpretations, and the facts in this case were clear. The food was contaminated, and the passenger's complaint was valid. His decision to speak up was also influenced by his own experiences with workplace bias. In the tech industry, he had often been the only Asian engineer in meetings where his ideas were dismissed or credited to others. He understood the isolating feeling of facing discrimination while bystanders remained silent, and he refused to be complicit in what he was witnessing. Brandi whirled around to face him, her anger now fully unleashed. "Sir, I'll thank you not to interfere with how I handle my passengers," she said, emphasizing the possessive pronoun in a way that made her attitude crystal clear. "This doesn't concern you." The phrase "my passengers" revealed Brandi's fundamental misunderstanding of her role. Passengers weren't her possessions to be managed according to her personal prejudices. They were customers who deserved equal treatment regardless of her personal feelings. Her attempt to exclude other passengers from witnessing her discriminatory behavior demonstrated that she understood her actions were problematic. Tom held up his phone, which had been recording for the past several minutes. "Actually," he said calmly, as a passenger on this aircraft, "safety concerns do involve all of us. And as someone with a social media platform, I think people should know how this airline treats its customers." His mention of social media was strategic. Tom had built a following of over 100,000 people on various platforms by documenting instances of workplace discrimination and bias in the tech industry. He understood the power of viral content to create accountability where traditional channels failed. His calm, factual approach to documenting discrimination had previously resulted in policy changes at major corporations. The mention of social media and recording seemed to penetrate Brandi's anger for the first time. She glanced around the cabin and noticed that several other passengers were also holding up phones, their cameras clearly focused on the ongoing confrontation. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face as she realized the situation might have consequences beyond a single flight. But instead of using this moment of clarity to de-escalate, Brandi doubled down on her hostility. Her pride and prejudice had created a situation where backing down felt like admitting fault, and her defensive psychology wouldn't allow that level of self-reflection. The very qualities that helped her advance in her career, confidence and unwillingness to be challenged, now became liabilities. Dr. Johnson remained perfectly calm throughout the escalating hostility. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I think you're absolutely right," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made several passengers lean forward to hear better. "This situation does need to be documented and addressed at the highest level." As she unlocked her phone, Dr. Johnson's fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency. She was sending a text message, but not to a complaint department or customer service line. The message was going directly to her chief operating officer with a simple instruction: initiate emergency protocol for Skyline Airways. Full documentation required. The emergency protocol was a comprehensive system Dr. Johnson had developed for evaluating acquisition targets. Within minutes of receiving her message, her team would begin pulling financial records, customer complaint data, employee satisfaction surveys, and operational metrics. The goal was to build a complete picture of the company's culture and performance that could be used to justify acquisition decisions or identify necessary reforms. Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Johnson's COO, was in her office reviewing quarterly reports when an emergency message arrived. She immediately understood the significance and began coordinating with the legal team, finance department, and public relations specialists. The protocol had been used only 3 times previously, each resulting in successful acquisitions of underperforming airlines that were transformed into industry leaders. Brandi watched the texting with growing unease, though she couldn't have imagined the true significance of what she was witnessing. In her mind, Dr. Johnson was probably complaining to a friend or trying to get social media attention. The possibility that she might be communicating with people who could fundamentally alter the trajectory of Skyline Airways' future was beyond Brandi's comprehension. What passengers couldn't see was the immediate response Dr. Johnson's message triggered. Within minutes, her COO was pulling up Skyline Airways' financial records, recent customer complaint data, and internal communications from the company's executives. The preliminary acquisition research her team had been conducting was suddenly taking on new urgency. If this level of discrimination was occurring in first class, what was happening throughout the rest of the airline's operations? Meanwhile, in the cabin, Brandi was becoming increasingly agitated by Dr. Johnson's calm demeanor. She had expected anger, defensiveness, or capitulation. Instead, she was facing someone who seemed completely unruffled by what should have been a humiliating public confrontation. It was as if Dr. Johnson knew something that Brandi didn't, and that knowledge was giving her confidence that seemed completely at odds with her position as a target of discriminatory treatment. The psychological dynamic was fascinating to observe. Brandi had initiated the confrontation from a position of perceived authority, expecting to dominate the interaction through institutional power and racial privilege. But Dr. Johnson's composed response was undermining that dynamic, creating uncertainty about who actually held power in the situation. Other passengers were beginning to sense this shift as well. Richard Sterling found himself reassessing his initial assumptions about both women. The flight attendant who had seemed so professional and competent was revealing herself to be unprofessional and biased, while the passenger she was mistreating displayed the kind of composure and authority he associated with successful executives. Dr. Johnson's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the caller ID and saw it was her COO calling back with preliminary information. "Excuse me," she said to Tom Chun, who had remained nearby, offering support. "I need to take this call." "Sarah," Dr. Johnson said into the phone, her voice professional, but carrying an undertone that suggested significant developments were in motion. "Yes, I'm still in the aircraft." "No, the situation has not improved. In fact, it's escalated significantly." The conversation was brief, but intense. Dr. Johnson's OO reported that Skyline Airways was in worse financial condition than their initial research had suggested. Customer complaint patterns showed systematic discrimination issues across multiple routes and crew bases. The company was vulnerable to acquisition, and the incident Dr. Johnson was experiencing provided perfect justification for a hostile takeover. Sarah had spent the past 30 minutes coordinating with their legal and finance teams. The preliminary numbers were stark. Skyline Airways had lost over $2 million in the past quarter due to customer defections, many of which correlated with discrimination complaints. Their stock price had been declining steadily, making them an ideal acquisition target for a company with Dr. Johnson's resources and expertise. Brandi watched nervously as Dr. Johnson continued her conversation, though she couldn't make out the details over the ambient noise of the aircraft. What she could see was that this passenger seemed to have immediate access to people who took her concerns seriously, and that realization was beginning to penetrate her anger. The call lasted less than 3 minutes, but its implications would reshape everything about Skyline Airways' future. When Dr. Johnson hung up, she looked directly at Brandi for the first time since the confrontation began. Her expression was calm, but there was something in her eyes that made Brandi instinctively take a step backward. "I think," Dr. Johnson said quietly, "that we're going to need to have a much more serious conversation about this situation. But not here and not now." The statement was delivered with such quiet authority that it silenced the entire first-class cabin. Even passengers who hadn't been directly involved in the confrontation turned to look at Dr. Johnson, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone could feel it. Before Brandi could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that confused everyone in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we received a priority communication from our operations center. We'll be making a slight adjustment to our arrival gate to accommodate some additional ground personnel who need to meet our aircraft upon arrival." Dr. Johnson smiled slightly, the first genuine emotion she had shown since the confrontation began. "That would be my team," she said simply, her words directed at no one in particular, but clearly audible to everyone nearby. The comment sent a chill through Brandi's body. "Your team," she repeated, her voice suddenly uncertain. Dr. Johnson returned her attention to her phone, dismissing Brandi without another word. The power dynamic in the cabin had shifted fundamentally, though most people couldn't yet understand why. The confident, hostile flight attendant who had publicly humiliated a passenger was now clearly the one in trouble, and everyone could sense it. For the remaining 90 minutes of flight, Brandi moved through her duties like someone in a trance. She served other passengers with mechanical efficiency, but the confident authority she had displayed earlier was completely gone. Several times, she found excuses to walk past Dr. Johnson's seat, studying her with growing unease. There was something about this passenger that didn't fit the assumptions Brandi had made, and the realization was eating away at her composure. Dr. Johnson, meanwhile, spent the rest of the flight on her phone and tablet, conducting what appeared to be a series of very serious business conversations. Other passengers couldn't help but notice that she seemed to be coordinating multiple people on complex logistics, and that her tone carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. The transformation in cabin atmosphere was remarkable. Passengers who had initially been sympathetic to Brandi's position began to distance themselves from her behavior. The elderly couple spoke in hushed, disapproving tones about what they had witnessed. The young mother made a point of smiling supportively at Dr. Johnson. Even passengers who hadn't directly witnessed the confrontation seemed to sense that something significant had occurred. Richard Sterling, the businessman who had been recording the incident, approached Dr. Johnson during a quiet moment. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I wanted you to know that I've documented everything that happened here today. If you need witness testimony for any formal complaint, I'd be happy to provide it." Dr. Johnson looked up at him with genuine appreciation. "That's very kind of you," she replied. "I suspect there will be many people interested in what occurred on this flight." Her response was cryptic, but carried an undertone that suggested this incident would have consequences far beyond a typical customer complaint. Richard found himself increasingly curious about this passenger who had remained so composed under such hostile treatment and seemed to possess resources that most people could only dream of. As the aircraft began its descent into Los Angeles, Brandi made one final attempt to salvage the situation. She approached Dr. Johnson's seat with what she hoped looked like a conciliatory expression, her earlier hostility replaced by obvious desperation. "Ma'am," she said, her voice much softer than it had been earlier, "I wanted to apologize if there was any misunderstanding about the meal service. Sometimes these long flights can make everyone a little tense." Dr. Johnson looked up at her with an expression of mild curiosity. "Misunderstanding," she repeated thoughtfully. Is that what you're calling it? Brandi's face flushed as she realized her attempt at damage control had only made things worse. I just meant that maybe we could work something out, she said desperately. You know, customer service recovery and all that. The desperation in Brandi's voice was apparent to everyone within earshot. The confident, hostile flight attendant who had publicly humiliated a passenger was now begging for some kind of resolution that might save her from consequences she was beginning to understand might be very serious indeed. Her supervisor's warnings about customer complaints suddenly seemed much more serious than she had originally believed. The realization that this incident might cost her job was beginning to penetrate her defensive psychology, but it was too late for a genuine apology or meaningful behavior change. Dr. Johnson's response was delivered with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. I appreciate your concern, she said, but I think this situation is already being worked out at levels far above either of our positions. The statement was both dismissive and ominous. Brandi found herself wondering what Dr. Johnson meant by levels far above their positions. Was she connected to airline management? Did she know someone on the board of directors? The possibilities were troubling. But Brandi's limited perspective prevented her from imagining the true scope of what was about to unfold. The aircraft touched down at LAX with its usual gentle bump, and passengers began preparing for deplaning. But instead of the typical smooth transition from arrival to gate, the plane remained on a remote taxiway much longer than usual. Through the cabin windows, passengers could see several black SUVs with tinted windows positioned near the aircraft, along with what appeared to be airline executives and other official-looking personnel. Brandi watched this unusual welcoming committee with growing panic. In 15 years of flying, she had never seen anything like it. Passengers didn't get met by convoys of executives and security personnel unless something very significant was happening. The realization that this level of response was connected to her treatment of Dr. Johnson was beginning to dawn on her. The ground crew seemed to be coordinating with the people in the SUVs, and there was an unusual amount of activity around the aircraft. Several people with official-looking badges were talking intently, occasionally gesturing toward the plane. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, as if everyone on the ground was waiting for something important to happen. The captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be holding our position for just a few more minutes while some VIP passengers are met by ground personnel. We appreciate your patience during this slight delay. The announcement confirmed what Brandi had been fearing. The passenger she had treated so poorly was important enough to warrant VIP treatment from the airline, but she still couldn't imagine the true scope of Dr. Johnson's influence or the consequences that were about to unfold. Dr. Johnson gathered her belongings with the same calm efficiency she had displayed throughout the flight. As she stood to leave, Tom Chin approached her one final time. I meant what I said about being a witness. He told her quietly, whatever you're planning to do about the situation, you have my full support. Thank you, Dr. Johnson replied with genuine warmth. I have a feeling there will be plenty of witnesses to what happens next. Richard Sterling also stepped forward, extending his business card. Ma'am, if you need any additional documentation or testimony, please don't hesitate to contact me. What I witnessed today was completely unacceptable. Miranda Walsh, the actress who had been traveling incognito, discreetly approached as well. I recorded everything, she whispered. This needs to be seen by everyone. As Dr. Johnson moved toward the aircraft door, Brandi positioned herself near the galley, hoping to avoid any final confrontation. But her attempt to become invisible was futile. Dr. Johnson paused directly in front of her, their eyes meeting for what would be the last time. Brandi, Dr. Johnson said, her voice carrying throughout the now quiet cabin, I want you to remember this moment. Remember the choice you made when you decided to serve a passenger moldy food because of how she looked. Remember the words you used when you told her that people like her didn't deserve respect. And remember how it felt when you realized that your assumptions about power and worth were completely wrong. With that, Dr. Johnson walked off the aircraft, leaving Brandi standing frozen in the galley, her face ashen with the realization that her career had just ended in the most public and devastating way possible. The black SUVs that had been waiting on the tarmac immediately surrounded Dr. Johnson as she descended the aircraft stairs. News crews, who had been mysteriously alerted to the situation, captured every moment as one of the most powerful executives in the aviation industry was met by her team after experiencing discrimination that would soon become a landmark case in corporate accountability. The media presence wasn't accidental. Dr. Johnson's communications team had coordinated with major news outlets to ensure maximum coverage of what was about to unfold. The story of discrimination in first class was compelling enough, but the revelation that the victim was a billionaire CEO with the power to acquire the offending airline would make this front-page news across the country. Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Johnson's OO, stepped forward to greet her boss. "The documentation is complete," she said, quietly. "Legal has confirmed we have grounds for immediate action, and the board is prepared to authorize full acquisition within the hour." Dr. Johnson nodded, her expression remaining composed despite the magnitude of what was happening. The incident had provided the perfect catalyst for an acquisition that would transform Skyline Airways from a discriminatory, failing company into a model of inclusive service excellence. Meanwhile, back in the aircraft, Brandi was experiencing the full weight of her actions. Other crew members had heard about the confrontation through whispered conversations, and their expressions ranged from shock to disapproval. Her supervisor, Jennifer Martinez, had been notified of the incident and was already preparing for damage control meetings with senior management. Captain Williams, who had been flying for Skyline Airways for 22 years, made his way back to the first-class cabin to assess the situation. The reports he had received from ground control about VIP passengers and media presence were unprecedented in his experience. When he saw the convoy of vehicles and news crews surrounding the aircraft, he realized that this incident was far more serious than a typical customer service complaint. Jennifer Martinez boarded the aircraft within minutes, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene. The passenger complaints she had been discussing with Brandi during recent performance reviews had suddenly taken on new urgency. This wasn't just about poor service ratings anymore. This was about the potential destruction of her crew's careers and the airline's reputation. "Brandi," Jennifer said quietly, "we need to talk immediately. Please gather your belongings and come with me." The walk from the aircraft to the terminal felt like the longest journey of Brandi's life. Other passengers and crew members watched as she was escorted away, their expressions reflecting the gravity of what had occurred. The confident flight attendant who had started the day believing she was in control of her cabin was now facing the complete collapse of her professional world. Within 6 hours, video footage of Brandi's treatment of Dr. Johnson was trending across every major social media platform. The hashtag Skyline Shame was being shared millions of times, accompanied by calls for boycotts and demands for systemic change within the airline industry. But the social media storm was nothing compared to what was happening in corporate boardrooms across the country. Tom Chen's social media presence proved instrumental in amplifying the story. His followers, many of whom had experienced similar discrimination in various industries, shared the footage with their own networks, creating a viral chain reaction that reached millions of people within hours. The clear documentation of discrimination, combined with the shocking revelation of the victim's identity, created a perfect storm of public outrage. Miranda Walsh used her celebrity platform to further amplify the message, posting the footage to her 15 million followers with a caption that read, "This is what discrimination looks like in 2024. No one should face this treatment, but it happens every day to people without the power to fight back. This ends now." Dr. Johnson's acquisition team had moved with unprecedented speed. By the time Brandi's shift officially ended, Johnson Aviation Holdings had acquired a controlling stake in Skyline Airways through a hostile takeover that blindsided the airline's board of directors. The company that had employed Brandi for 15 years was now owned by the passenger she had humiliated. The hostile takeover was executed through a combination of stock purchases, proxy fights, and strategic partnerships with other institutional investors. Dr. Johnson's team had been preparing for this possibility for months, and Brandi's discriminatory behavior provided the perfect justification for immediate action. Within hours, the company's stock price had plummeted as news of the incident spread, making the acquisition even more cost-effective. The financial mechanics were complex but effective. Dr. Johnson's holding company had assembled a coalition of investors who shared her vision of transforming airline customer service. When a discrimination incident provided moral justification for takeover, these investors moved quickly to acquire shares at drastically reduced prices. The speed and coordination of the acquisition suggested that this had been planned for some time, waiting only for the right catalyst. The termination meeting took place in a sterile conference room at LAX, with Brandi facing a panel of executives she had never seen before. The conversation was brief and to the point. Her employment was terminated immediately for violation of company policy, discrimination against a passenger, and conduct unbecoming of an airline employee. There would be no severance package, no letter of recommendation, and no opportunity for redemption. Harold Chun, the newly appointed interim HR director representing Johnson Aviation Holdings, read from prepared statement. Ms. Morrison, your actions today violated not only company policy, but basic human decency. The discrimination you displayed toward a passenger is indefensible and has exposed this airline to significant legal and financial liability. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. The legal implications were severe as well. Brandi's actions had exposed Skyline Airways to significant liability for discrimination, creating ground for lawsuits and regulatory action. The company's insurance providers were already distancing themselves from coverage related to discriminatory practices, leaving the airline financially vulnerable just as it was being acquired. Civil rights organizations quickly took notice of the case, with several announcing their intention to use it as a test case for strengthening anti-discrimination enforcement in the airline industry. The combination of clear video evidence, multiple witnesses, and the victim's high profile created an ideal opportunity to establish stronger legal precedents for equal treatment in commercial aviation. As news of the acquisition spread, other Skyline Airways employees began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. The passenger in seat 2 hadn't just been someone with influence or connections. She had been the person who now controlled their company's future, and one employee's prejudice had triggered a complete corporate takeover. Emergency meetings were called at Skyline Airways facilities across the country as employees tried to understand what the acquisition meant for their jobs and the company's future. Many were relieved to learn that Dr. Johnson's track record suggested improved working conditions and better training, while others worried about potential job losses during the transition period. Dr. Johnson held a press conference the following day, standing before a wall of cameras and microphones as she announced her plans for Skyline Airways. The acquisition, she explained, was about more than business. It was about proving that discrimination had real consequences, and that companies that tolerated prejudice would be held accountable by the very people they mistreated. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Johnson began, her voice steady and authoritative. Yesterday's incident aboard Skyline Airways Flight 447 was not an isolated event. It was symptomatic of a culture that has tolerated discrimination for far too long. Today, that culture ends. She outlined a comprehensive transformation plan that would touch every aspect of the airline's operations. New hiring practices, mandatory bias training, customer service protocols, and accountability measures will be implemented within 60 days. The changes weren't cosmetic. They represented a fundamental reimagining of how an airline could operate when respect for all passengers became the primary operational principle. The new policies implemented under Dr. Johnson's leadership became the gold standard for the aviation industry. Mandatory bias training, anonymous reporting systems for discrimination, and zero-tolerance policies for employee misconduct transformed Skyline Airways from a company hemorrhaging customers to one with the highest satisfaction ratings in the industry. The bias training wasn't a typical corporate diversity workshop that employees could sleep through. Instead, Dr. Johnson implemented immersive simulations where employees experienced service from the perspective of passengers who faced discrimination. The training was uncomfortable, challenging, and effective, forcing participants to confront their own unconscious biases and develop genuine empathy for all passengers. Customer satisfaction metrics improved dramatically within the first quarter under Dr. Johnson's leadership. Passenger complaints dropped by 78%, while positive reviews increased by over 200%. Most significantly, the disparity in service quality between different demographic groups disappeared entirely, creating the truly equitable service experience that Dr. Johnson had envisioned. Brandi Morrison's story became a cautionary tale told in business schools and corporate training sessions across the country. Her 15-year career ended not because of economic downturns or industry changes, but because she had made the fundamental mistake of assuming that power and worth could be determined by appearance. The case study became required reading in hospitality management programs, demonstrating how individual prejudice could destroy both personal careers and corporate value. Business schools use Brandi's termination as an example of how quickly discriminatory behavior could escalate from a customer service issue to a corporate crisis with millions of dollars in consequences. 6 months after the incident, Dr. Johnson received a handwritten letter from Brandi. It was a genuine apology, acknowledging the harm she had caused and the lessons she had learned from the consequences of her actions. Dr. Johnson read the letter carefully, recognizing the sincerity behind the words, but knowing that some mistakes carry permanent consequences. The letter revealed that Brandi had spent months in therapy, working to understand the roots of her prejudiced behavior and developing genuine insight into the harm she had caused. She had enrolled in diversity and inclusion courses, volunteered with civil rights organizations, and was working to rebuild her life around principles of equality and respect. While Dr. Johnson appreciated the evidence of genuine growth, she also understood that meaningful change required accountability. Brandi's letter was forwarded to her foundation's Second Chance Employment Program, which helped people who had lost jobs due to discriminatory behavior find new opportunities after demonstrating genuine reform and education. The aircraft that had been the scene of Brandi's downfall continued to fly daily routes across the country, but now it carried passengers who were treated with universal respect and dignity. The galley where moldy bread had been served to a paying customer was now stocked with the finest meals in commercial aviation, prepared and served by staff who understood that every passenger deserved the same high standard of service. Flight 447's route became known internally as the Dignity Flight, serving as a daily reminder to all crew members of the importance of treating every passenger with equal respect. Seat 2A, where Dr. Johnson had experienced discrimination, was marked with small plaque reading respect for all, ensuring that future passengers and crew would remember the lessons learned from that transformative day. Dr. Johnson continued her practice of flying incognito on various airlines, but now her presence sent ripples of positive change throughout the industry. Word spread that the consequences of discrimination could be swift, severe, and permanent. The 12 minutes between serving moldy food and career destruction had become legendary in aviation circles, a reminder that in the modern world, prejudice was not just morally wrong, but professionally suicidal. Other airlines quickly implemented their own anti-discrimination policies, fearful that they might be the next target of Dr. Johnson's acquisition strategy. The entire industry was forced to confront the reality that discriminatory practices weren't just ethically wrong. They were existential threats to corporate survival in an era where accountability could be swift and decisive. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation into other service industries. Hotels, restaurants, retail chains, and other businesses that relied on customer service began implementing similar accountability measures, recognizing that the same dynamics could affect their operations. Dr. Johnson's transformation of Skyline Airways became a case study for organizational change across multiple industries. The legacy of Flight 447 extended far beyond one terminated employee or one acquired airline. It became a symbol of how individual choices could trigger systematic change, and how the assumption that certain people could be mistreated without consequences was not just wrong, but dangerous. Dr. Johnson had proven that respect wasn't just a moral imperative. It was a business necessity, and companies that failed to understand that lesson would face consequences as swift and decisive as justice itself. The story resonated globally, with international media covering the incident as an example of how individual accountability could drive systemic change. Civil rights organizations around the world used the case as evidence that progress was possible when consequences for discrimination were immediate and severe. Tom Chen's documentation of the incident led to his being invited to speak at conferences about the power of bystander intervention and social media accountability. His calm, factual approach to recording discrimination became a model for others facing similar situations, demonstrating that ordinary people could play crucial roles in creating change. Richard Sterling's witnessing of the event changed his own perspective on corporate responsibility. He implemented new policies at his hedge fund to ensure that their investment decisions considered companies' diversity and inclusion practices, recognizing that discriminatory cultures represented both moral failures and financial risks. Miranda Walsh used her platform to establish a foundation focused on documenting and addressing discrimination in the entertainment industry. Her experience on Flight 447 had reminded her of her own early career struggles with prejudice, and she was determined to create accountability systems that could protect others from similar treatment. The story ended not with revenge, but with transformation. Skyline Airways became a model for inclusive service. Brandi's termination became a teaching moment for an entire industry, and Dr. Johnson's quiet dignity in the face of discrimination became an inspiration for anyone who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. In exactly 12 minutes, everything had changed, proving that in the modern world, prejudice was not just wrong, it was extinct. Years later, when business students studied the case, they would marvel at how quickly everything had unfolded. 12 minutes from moldy bread to career destruction. 12 minutes from discrimination to accountability. 12 minutes from prejudice to justice. It became known as the 12-minute rule. The time it takes for someone's true character to be revealed and for consequences to begin. The transformation of Skyline Airways under Dr. Johnson's leadership became the gold standard for corporate culture change. Customer satisfaction scores reached unprecedented levels, employee retention improved dramatically, and the company became the most sought-after employer in the aviation industry. The financial performance followed the cultural transformation, with Skyline Airways becoming one of the most profitable airlines in the world. Dr. Johnson's approach proved that treating all customers with equal dignity wasn't just morally right, it was economically superior. The investment in respect and equality generated returns that far exceeded the costs, creating a business model that other industries rushed to emulate. The incident also sparked broader conversations about unconscious bias, customer service excellence, and corporate accountability. Universities developed new curricula around these themes, and professional development programs incorporated the lessons learned from Flight 447 into their training materials. Most importantly, the story gave hope to millions of people who had experienced discrimination but felt powerless to address it. Dr. Johnson's example demonstrated that justice was possible, that accountability could be achieved, and that change had happened when people with power chose to use it responsibly. The 12 minutes that destroyed Brandi Morrison's career became 12 minutes that transformed an industry, proving that individual actions can indeed create systemic change when the right person was watching, recording, and ready to act. In the end, it wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about creating a world where everyone could travel with dignity, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. If you believe everyone deserves respect and dignity, share this story with others. Hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced or witnessed discrimination like this. Because the only way we create lasting change is when each of us commits to treating every person with the respect they deserve and holding accountable those who choose prejudice over humanity.